So let me start the conversation by asking you kind of a broad question. GDPR has been described as the most significant overhaul of data privacy and protection laws ever. Big deal. With resources for managing third-party cybersecurity already very, very heavily stretched, what do you think will be the impact of this new regulation?
So, I know it's probably a bit of a review for a number of the folks on the phone today, but for others, I think it probably makes sense to start with the intent of GDPR. And you already touched on this a bit with your introduction, but it's an update to a 1995 directive when technology, the use of private consumer data, and the understanding of the impact of data breaches was quite different than it is today. It's certainly receiving a lot of attention also because of the penalties, which can be up to 4% of global revenue for organizations that are found to be in violation. And I'd say, there's really three areas that GDPR focuses on with regard to this particular topic. And those are the strengthening of consumer rights. So there are a number of new requirements related to things such as fast notification of breaches, the right to access at no charge the data that's captured about you, the ability to transfer your data, the right to be forgotten, et cetera. Secondly, it really, as you pointed out, clarifies and streamlines a lot of the regulatory environment. So in the past, companies have had to navigate each EU country's requirements separately, while GDPR sets a clear, more comprehensive set of standards. And lastly, and perhaps in some cases most significantly, it really raises the stakes. So clearly, with all the focus on potential fines, companies will be taking a more serious look at the procedures that need to be in place for them to be in compliance. And I think it's really that last item that's likely to have the greatest impact to third-party cybersecurity and risk management. As you mentioned in your question, most cybersecurity teams or third-party risk management teams are already stretched pretty thin and are doing everything they can to keep up with the workload that companies have already, in a lot of cases, imposed on themselves, or that's required to be in compliance with whatever limited regulatory commitments they might have. Now we see something like GDPR where the reach is wider and the penalties are much greater. It isn't likely that companies are going to be willing to take the risk, maybe that they were in the past, of maintaining the status quo and attempting to kind of skirt the edge of compliance and sort of risk maybe the slap on the wrist that might come. So really, their options become hire more security professionals to maintain the same level of due diligence across a larger number of third parties, and this approach has its own set of unique challenges, or make the investment to change the approach to third-party security so that it scales better and it's more capable of meeting requirements of GDPR or whatever else might come along. I think, at least in my experience, this impact and change can already be seen heavily with companies in Europe. But what I find interesting is that I don't see or hear enough U.S. companies talking about GDPR, especially the small to mid-sized ones. GDPR by design applies to almost any company that does business with EU citizens or has access to their personal information. This is not just something European countries have to be focused on, and I think it's going to be interesting to see what the catalyst will be that causes U.S. companies to stand up and take note.
So this really does raise the stakes. Fines of up to 4% of a company's global turnover. This is quite a significant enhancement of regulatory capability. John, how does the information security process need to change in light of this significantly more stringent regulatory environment? And how easy will it be for companies to adapt their existing processes?
That's a great question. That's one we spend a lot of time on at RiskRecon. And when we talk about GDPR or any other new regulation that might come along and how significantly they extend the reach beyond just companies doing business in the EU or in whatever the geographic area, if it's GDPR or something else, we now have a situation where companies are faced with a couple of issues to deal with very, very quickly. Issue one being, how do I do more? How, perhaps significantly more than I have been doing to date. And when I say more, that might mean more vendors to perform due diligence on and continuously monitor, or more in-depth vetting of my existing vendors. And with GDPR, those suppliers that I have to be responsible for and have to have a greater understanding of are essentially being dictated to me at this point by based on the type of data or information that I share with them, instead of what might have been going on historically, where my organization decides for ourselves what is or is not critical based on the inherent risk that that vendor may pose to my organization. If I'm currently covering my obligations to the regulatory bodies by monitoring a small handful of my critical third-party suppliers, the extended reach of GDPR means that I now have to expand that out to include a much broader set of suppliers and perhaps a broader set of criteria that I need to monitor on. The second major issue is really, how do I do it better? With the stricter regulations, in many cases comes more stringent validation required to prove that organizations handling personal data are performing as they need to perform from a security standpoint. It's likely no longer going to be good enough for most organizations to rely on third-party security questionnaires or attestations alone when they're dealing with those vendors. So now I, as an organization, need to show that I'm taking appropriate steps to validate the information that a third party provides. And in many cases, this isn't just a one-time validation either. I need to show that I'm maintaining some level of visibility into the activity of my third parties as long as they are processing data on my or my customer's behalf. These changes don't necessarily sound significant, but the reality in most cases is that the current processes in use don't scale very well in these areas because they're fairly manpower intensive. When it comes to showing that due diligence has been performed above and beyond sending, receiving, or reviewing a third party's attestations. Processes really, kind of getting back to your original question, processes really need to change in a way that more heavily incorporates the technology solutions that are becoming available in this space. I mean, solutions like those provided by RiskRecon and Opus that are really a force multiplier when you make the investment to build your processes around the efficiencies that those solutions offer.
So John, just to add to what you're saying here, I have been known to make the point frequently that even as things change, they stay the same. The good old-fashioned best practices tend to be the best defense against new cyber risks and the best way to address new regulation. The point you made about how the type of data shared with vendor dictates what GDPR wants you to do in terms of assessing them. There might be very much of a U.S. standard that is increasingly being used, NIST. Wouldn't you say that that's a good parallel there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's fair to draw the comparison. It's amazing to me how much we run into organizations that, kind of to my earlier point, they've been making those decisions on their own. They're not necessarily forced to follow a particular set of guidelines. I mean, obviously there are regulations out there, when we're talking about things in the U.S. that apply to certain industries or certain jurisdictions, but aren't necessarily a broad stroke approach to it. So yeah, when organizations who have historically been kind of making these decisions on their own in the best interest of their security and their customer security, then start to look at conforming to some sort of standard, like NIST, for example, I think it's a bit of an eye-opener to realize that there's a lot more involved in securing their environment than maybe they had initially thought when they had done their own assessments in-house.
So John, we all know that risk evolves. But with so many third-party relationships to bring on board and manage, is it possible to proactively monitor these relationships for new and emerging risks?
Yeah, great question, and this is one that we run into all the time with what we do at RiskRecon, and I do believe that it is possible, but not without the understanding that we can't rely on the traditional methods alone if we want to adapt at a rate that's even close to the rate that threats are evolving. We talk a lot about the people, the processes, and technology that are brought to bear in an effort to deal with the risks that we face. It isn't very, very realistic to try to solve the problem by throwing more people at it, because in many cases the people just aren't there for us to hire. The processes that we use need to change to be more streamlined and adaptable, but they need to change in a way that takes advantage of the technologies that are now available. I know that when we start talking about technology, the cost is always a deterrent to bringing on a new technology. But there is a significant ROI to be realized with some of the solutions that are available today. The challenge is that ROI will only be realized to the extent that organizations are willing to change and streamline their processes to take advantage of that technology. Once those investments in technology and process change are made, the foundation has essentially been laid that will pay dividends in terms of the ability to adapt and react as our third-party relationships, as our third-party relationships expand, new threats emerge, and new regulations are pushed out.
So what you're saying reminds me very much of what I see in many of our customers and other people that I talk to, that they're recognizing that new regulation and really new threats are forcing them to rethink their approach to cybersecurity and to privacy. And while the cost of new technology is high, there's no question about it, what we're seeing is that the leaders, the people who are the companies that are moving ahead, are the ones that are thinking about the classic trio, people, process, and technology. They're putting it together. As you said, it's hard to find more people, and it's very, very hard to train them. And I'm sure somebody will raise a question about that if we allow them to. But if companies are willing to change and willing to adopt processes that harness new technologies, they're going to see dividends, not just in terms of complying with GDPR, but regulation all over, and the huge existential threat that cybersecurity and cybercrime pose to many organizations. John, can you tell us a little bit more about RiskRecon and how your customers benefit from using your services?
Sure, absolutely. We at RiskRecon provide an automated SaaS solution that produces prioritized action plans for third-party risk professionals and their suppliers. Our continuous monitoring solution combines direct profiling of a supplier's internet-facing systems with proprietary security analytics to determine the risk value of an organization's assets, and also the severity of the security issues that are associated with those assets. Through our portal, you and your vendors can easily share these prioritized plans and the detailed findings without any usage limitations or fees. Unlike rating services, RiskRecon does not rely on purchase databases or noisy threat intelligence sources. We deliver prioritized plans, accurate evidence, and clear remediation steps, and our results appear in a transparent and actionable format that really doesn't require any extensive security expertise to understand or interpret. Really, the bottom line is that RiskRecon enables you to dramatically improve your third-party risk management program. With our solution, you can monitor large numbers of vendors and make efficient, accurate decisions related to the third-party assets that represent the most significant risk to your organization. And you can far more effectively prioritize staffing, collaborate with suppliers, and accelerate risk reduction efforts with that kind of platform in place.
So, John, can I drill down a little bit on a couple of the points you made?
Sure.
All forms of due diligence are stymied by noise, false positive checking, the ability to eliminate the distractions and to focus on the actual information. These are huge, and many of the people I talk to, they get information about an organization, and what they really need is information about a particular service within an organization. Can you drill down a little bit further about how RiskRecon eliminates the noise and provides information that's, I think that you often say, actionable? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So there's a couple of different, I think, key things to point out when we're talking about RiskRecon and perhaps how we are significantly different than a lot of the other services out there that attempt to measure the security of an organization from the outside. So RiskRecon, primarily, I would say, and probably one of the most significant areas, is different in the fact that 95+% of the data and information and detail that you see on an organization when you log in and look at our portal and the detail provided, 95% or better of that information is made through direct observation of that particular entity. So we're not buying information from other databases and repurposing that data. We're not buying threat intelligence data and repurposing it. We're making that through direct observation and essentially creating a very high fidelity, very comprehensive map of that organization's internet-facing systems. And we're doing it all without doing any kind of port scanning or form filling or anything like that. So it's very, very friendly, very non-intrusive, and ultimately what results is a lot of detail and information, security findings related to that very, very detailed, very high fidelity, very comprehensive internet-facing infrastructure map of an organization. So we're starting, I guess at the very base, we're starting with known good information, very accurate information that we're then making measurements against. And those measurements are made, again, through our own proprietary models and algorithms to ultimately give you specific findings and details, whether it's related to software patching or email security or DNS security, very detailed and actionable information that is specific to and can be driven down to the host or domain level for a specific organization.
So can you just go a little deeper there? I think that last point is very important for our audience to understand about your solution, the level of detail. So can you give a couple of examples about what is that level of detail? How far are you going?
Sure, absolutely. So again, as we're creating that comprehensive map of an organization, that host map, we'll call it, really the internet-facing infrastructure for that organization. We're drilling down and collecting information on, and I'll use software patching as an example, just for the purpose of the conversation, but we measure across about 10 different domains and about 40 different criteria within those domains. But when we're talking, say, specifically about software patching, we're able to run the limited amount of information that's publicly available on a system, say a specific host, whether it's a web server or a mail server or an SSL VPN login page. Run that information through, or perhaps a transaction system might be a better example, but run that information through our proprietary algorithms and analytics engines, and ultimately produce detail on at the host level, so providing you with a host name, an IP address, everything that we're able to glean from that information about the software stack running on that particular system. So we can tell you if they're running end-of-life software. We can tell you if, in the case of web systems, if their web encryption is up to date, if they're using the appropriate algorithms. So a lot of very specific detail, and that very specific detail is tied directly to a host name and or IP address. So it allows you to take that information, and again, because this is all information that is made through direct observation and RiskRecon is generating that data, not purchasing the data, you can turn around and share this directly with your suppliers. So if we determine that a system on a supplier network is running end-of-life software and perhaps is not running the appropriate level of web encryption, you can turn around and share that report and that data and that information with that supplier and work with them to take action and improve their security. So again, very specific, very actionable information to really allow you to have that meaningful conversation and improve security with those suppliers.
So John, to make this even more specific, could a user of our Hyperos third-party workflow platform get an alert that was provided through an API call by RiskRecon saying that there's a problem with software patching, and then get an alert in our system, in the Hyperos system, pointing that to the right subject matter expert and giving them the detail behind it so that they know to go to that vendor? Essentially, it's a management by exception type of alert. Is that the right
Absolutely.
way to use our two platforms together?
Absolutely, and I think you really hit the nail on the head when you're talking about being able to pull that information in and kind of get that single pane of glass view of an organization. So organizations that are using Hyperos have the ability to, when we have a full API at RiskRecon, so all that data that I was talking about, all that data that's available in our portal is available via API. So that can actually be pulled from the RiskRecon systems and pulled into Hyperos and presented in whatever format you'd like to have that presented, essentially. And as those findings change, because again, the RiskRecon data is updated frequently from the ground up. So we expand and contract with an organization and continue to update those findings. All that findings detail can be pushed or pulled into Hyperos as an example, and give you the ability to very quickly react and adapt and see either the specific security findings or the roll up to an overall rating for an organization. So all that data is available and is available to be presented in Hyperos as well.
So we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you a kind of an overarching question here. Everybody I talk to says there's just not enough people in this space. Why is it so challenging to hire for InfoSec roles, and what can companies do to address this huge human resource issue?
Yeah, it's a big one. And this is definitely not an issue that's probably new to anyone in the information security field, and most likely none of the folks that are on the phone today. I'd say the biggest challenge right now in hiring is that most companies seem to all fish from the same pool and tend to poach each other's staff when looking for information security expertise. Then you have something like GDPR come along that puts an even more increased demand on something for which the supply is just not keeping up. Most companies could change this equation at least partially just by, perhaps hiring less experienced employees and committing to training them to fill the role. And also, maybe less significantly, but relying less on the sort of old boys network and starting to look for great talent in other areas or perhaps other demographic groups. Now I know that probably sounds like a bit of an oversimplification, but those are probably longer term solutions. But there's likely going to be a shortage of good InfoSec talent for a long time to come. And hiring information security roles within organizations, particularly those that are involved in assessing the security posture of an organization or the organizations within your supply chain, it's historically required almost linear hiring, because much of the work that needs to be done with the current approach to third-party security, or maybe the legacy approach to third-party security, is really very manpower intensive. As new suppliers, partners, service providers are brought on, additional analysts and security experts have to be hired to scale up, as the company's outsourced footprint grows. We're at an interesting point, though, now where what has long been thought of, and you kind of mentioned this in your question, what's long been thought of as a human resources issue or a talent gap may more easily and quickly be addressed with technology and process change. With solutions like those available, again, from Opus and RiskRecon, organizations can shift from this idea of how do I hire more people to scale when the talent pool is so small, to what solutions do I have available to me that would enable me to streamline my processes, accomplish more with the talent that I have, and then also do it more effectively than if I rely on individual expertise alone.
That's great information, John. So I want to turn it back over to Magali to see if we have any questions from the audience or to wrap up.
Hi, Dov. Yes, so we've had a few questions around enforcement of GDPR and whether either of you have any thoughts on how regulators will approach enforcement in the first year. So, for example, will they be looking for a company to make an example of, or will they take a more consultative approach and help companies understand what they need to be doing and how to improve?
John, you want to take that?
Sure. I'll take the first stab at it. So, it's a good question, and I wish I had a crystal ball to say that I knew for certain. But looking at things like this, I would have to believe that it's probably going to be maybe a combination of both, where it's really going to depend on how the infraction is discovered. I think that if we run into a situation where the first handful of issues are something that's determined through some sort of proactive audit, then I think we'll see more of a consultative approach. I think that there's going to be a little bit of grace period where that may occur. I think if it's a situation where we find a company in violation or of GDPR, but it's because of a data breach that occurs as a result of that, then I think we're going to see a very big example made of those companies. And I think going back to my statement earlier about companies in the U.S. and other areas, I think it'll also be interesting to see how and maybe where we'd see more significant lawsuits or attempts to kind of make an example would be organizations that are outside of the EU, where maybe there is less attention paid or perhaps a complete disregard for the regulations themselves, and how, to what extent will they go to try to make an example of those companies to make sure that the rest of the world kind of stands up and takes notice.
I think that's great. Good information. Magali, any other questions before we close up?
Yeah, I know we've only got a couple of minutes, but we do have a couple more. One is, how will NYDFS have an impact on third-party risk management?
It's a great one. John, you want to open up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar. I think that, if we're talking about NYDFS or we're talking about, GDPR, I think there are companies or organizations with NYDFS that, it directly applies to those organizations, but the scope is so much smaller. I think that it's going to be even more challenging with something like that to kind of apply the broad brush approach that we might see with GDPR. I'm a little skeptical, at least initially, and we'll kind of take both of these at the same time, whether or not GDPR and the regulation will ultimately have an impact on cybercrime. I'm even more skeptical with something like NYDFS, where, the scope is much smaller. It's a little hazy on exactly what the penalties are and how that's going to work. So I think organizations will pay attention and take note, but again, the scope is so much smaller. I'm not sure how quickly or to what extent we'll actually see a lot of action come out of that. I honestly think that companies regulatory bodies need to kind of follow suit with what GDPR is doing and take this broader brush approach to things.
Magali, any other questions?
There was one, I believe we've kind of answered that. Do you see the requirements of GDPR or a subset of requirements moving to the US in the near future? And I know we've touched on that in a couple of questions, but anything to add?
I'm going to
go ahead.
John, go ahead. Okay, so one of the points that I make every time I speak at an event is that even as new regulations proliferate and new threats are discovered, and they are virtually every day, the good old-fashioned best practices as to how to secure your data Fort Knox are still going to apply. And so it just requires more of a focus on really how do you actually secure an organization physically and in terms of your data. I think we're out of time. Magali, do you want to wrap up?
We are out of time. I think we've managed to touch on everybody's questions, so thank you to both of you. And that does bring us to the end of our webinar. If you'd like to learn more about the information security solutions that are offered by Opus and RiskRecon, please feel free to get in touch with me directly. You will see a screen up that has my email address on it. You will also receive my details by email. But otherwise, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I'd very much like to thank Dov and John for their participation. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.